Today, we're diving into the rapidly escalating confrontation between Russia and Ukraine. We are seeing new developments that suggest NATO is now openly telling Russia that crossing into their airspace again may result in shooting down drones and planes. And Moscow is fighting back with bold rhetorical claims that Western allied countries have already declared war upon Russia by supporting Ukraine. The bottom line is, European diplomats have warned Russian officials in Moscow that further incursions into NATO airspace will no longer be tolerated, and that might mean that the next step is shooting down jets. This is a major escalation in the war, because it raises the question as to why Russia is pushing their drones and jets into this airspace in the first place. Some observers think that it could be on purpose in order to start a larger conflict. Over the recent weeks, we have had repeated Russian incursions. This has included instances where drones and fighter jets have crossed into Polish, Romanian, Danish, and especially Estonian airspace. In one unique case, 3 MiG-31s flew inside Estonian airspace for 12 minutes. The MiG-31 is a Russian interceptor aircraft capable of reaching supersonic speeds, so it's not a small detail to mention that it has a history of illegal incursions into NATO airspace. In a meeting in Moscow, officials from Britain, France, and Germany made it clear that these violations must stop. And if Russia refuses to comply, NATO may respond with lethal force. Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany stated that he's coordinating with Paris, London, and Warsaw and supports all measures to defend their own airspace. Meanwhile, NATO's Article 4 has already been invoked multiple times this month, including over incidents in Poland and Estonia. Article 4 is generally invoked when there are threats posed to allied countries. There have been some instances where this has been considered and applied. Under pressure, the U.S. is supporting its allies. In fact, President Donald Trump has publicly said that NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft that violate allied airspace. NATO is signaling that it's willing to cross from defense into a form of direct engagement. Up until now, the support to Ukraine has largely been indirect. There have been a constant supply of weapons, funding, and intelligence. But now, these countries are telling Russia that they're ready to shoot its military aircraft down. Without explanation, it's obvious why this is a major escalation. And Russia is not taking these warnings lightly. In fact, the Russian ambassador to France, Alexei Meshkov, has told reporters that any attempt to shoot down a Russian plane would constitute war. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has already also accused NATO and the EU of already waging war against Russia. So now we have a standoff of escalating rhetoric. NATO is daring Moscow to test their resolve, and Russia is doubling down on them to actually pull the trigger. If Russia truly believes that the West's military, financial, and logistical support to Ukraine means that it has stepped over the line from assistance into direct conflict, then we have to view this war from an entirely new perspective, because this echoes earlier claims from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who said NATO is already at war with Russia. Russia has used Poland shooting down Russian drones, Romanian airspace violations, and repeated drone flights over NATO nations as evidence of them already being at war. In his eyes, this isn't just a proxy war through Ukraine. Instead, it's overt war by proxy, and the West is already footing much of the bill. NATO's position is defensible in principle. Sovereignty and territorial integrity are core pillars of the post-World War order. If a foreign power consistently violates your airspace and there's no response, then those standards start to collapse. NATO has signaled that its willingness to shoot down Russian jets is an extreme measure, but it's being sold by its proponents as a necessary escalation to defend integrity and deter further aggression. Russia's claim that the West has already declared war is rhetorically powerful. But there's a difference between supporting a war and being a direct party to it. Yes, the United States, the European Union, and NATO are sending weapons, intelligence, training, and funds, but they haven't deployed large ground armies on Russian soil. They also have not bombed Russia territory in force or issued unified declarations of war in the formal sense. So while Lavrov's rhetoric is useful for internal propaganda and deterrence, from an international legal standpoint, an official war has not been declared against Russia. But this much is obvious, at least from most observers. But that doesn't mean Putin doesn't want to drag all these additional countries into a world war. If NATO does shoot down a Russian jet, Moscow may not treat it as a limited conflict. They may retaliate elsewhere, which includes against NATO assets, military bases, or civilian infrastructure. That's why many Western officials have approached this possibility with great caution up to this point. President Trump's involvement also matters. His vocal support for shooting down violating Russian aircraft marks a departure from these more restrained approaches in the past. That kind of rhetoric energizes certain hawkish elements in U.S. foreign policy circles, but it also demonstrates peace through strength, which has been one of his campaign slogans since he started running for president. And while it may prove to be very effective against other enemy countries around the world, some are wondering if it's the best strategic move against Russia. Some observers are hoping that Russia steps back from airspace violations temporarily, and that a de-escalation path opens. This would be the best case scenario, and it would allow NATO to hold its line without triggering a larger full-blown war. But there's also a possibility of a major escalation. Moscow could escalate far beyond Ukraine, which could include strikes on NATO bases, attacks in the Baltic states, or they could even target European energy infrastructure. The conflict becomes much larger, essentially creating a war all across Europe, which would also likely drag in the United States as well. So, which scenario is most likely? Assuming cooler heads prevail on both sides, a number of smaller attacks are likely to take place before de-escalation is possible. But any wrong move from either side could result in total catastrophe. Putin may calculate that NATO doesn't have the stomach for a full conflict, especially one that could lead to nuclear escalation. But once certain thresholds are crossed, miscalculations or accidental incidents could trigger a cascade. Also, countries like Poland, Estonia, Romania, and Denmark may push NATO to act more forcefully. The politics inside Europe are shifting, and leaders are becoming less patient with perpetual Russian aggression. Trump's voice in this can't be overlooked. The Trump administration has leaned towards more aggressive deterrence and less towards diplomatic caution. Though it's worth noting that he still believes some progress can be made from their previous meeting in Alaska that was specifically designed to pursue peace. The financial, human, and political risks of a broader conflict loom large. The US and NATO would have to ask themselves whether defending airspace is worth inviting a war. Most would say yes, just based on simple principles. But Lavrov's sweeping claim that NATO and the EU have already declared war, that's designed to shift the narrative. It gives Moscow the moral high ground in its domestic propaganda, while also attempting to deter NATO from acting. There's room for European powers to continue intense deterrence without immediately triggering a responsive action. But once that line is crossed, then everything else in this conflict changes as well. For Americans, especially those who value strength without recklessness, the question becomes how to navigate this without dragging ourselves into a catastrophic conflict. Under a leader like President Donald Trump, we see a shift that the media hates admitting. The warrior mindset has returned, and there are fewer new wars, fewer direct confrontations, and more global adversaries are making peace rather than starting wars. But that doesn't mean everything's been successful. While Trump has ended several wars, he's admitted publicly that the one he expected to be the easiest was the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and he's had to accept the fact that it's turned out to be the hardest. Trump has not completely given up on the goal of securing peace between the two countries, but there are signs that if something is not done soon, he may be forced to abandon that peace mission and walk away from the table. This could have catastrophic consequences, but it's also a sensible decision for America's long-term interests and financial stability.